begin, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. We would like to remind you that food and drink are not permitted in the theater. Also, please note that photography and audio and video recording is prohibited. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Gray, the creative director of the New York Times live conversation series TimesTalks. For 20 years, TimesTalks has paired New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of film, theater, music, art, social justice, politics, and literature. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event with the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton, and the world-renowned author and philanthropist, James Patterson. The duo will discuss their collaborative writing process, their love of mysteries, and how the former president's first-hand experience has uniquely informed the plotline of this eagerly anticipated new novel, The President is Missing. Moderating tonight's conversation is Pamela Paul, editor of the New York Times Book Review and author of 4 books, By the Book, Parenting, Inc., Pornified, and The Start of Marriage and the Future of Matrimony. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Pamela Paul, James Patterson, and President Bill Clinton.
It's always a pleasure to welcome 2 totally unknown voices to the world of letters and readers.
Yeah, we're kind of like first novelists, right?
That's right. I think that inside every thriller there is a mystery, and to me the mystery in this thriller is obvious, which is, why did you do it, Mr. President? I mean, James Patterson, I can understand why you would want to co-author a book with President Bill Clinton, but...
I don't know, this is starting out bad. Why would you want to write with me? Why would you want to write with me?
I did it, first of all, I want to give credit where credit's due. Our mutual lawyer / agent / friend, Bob Barnett, came to me and said, you've been devouring thrillers for 35 years. I've been trying to get you to write one for more than 10 years. You're never going to do it. You're all caught up in your foundation and stuff. What about doing one with James Patterson? And I said the reverse of what you said. I said, are you kidding? He's the best-selling author in the world. Why would he want to mess with me? It's like he's giving me an internship. And so we had been together once before. He said he would. And I thought it would be interesting to see if you could make something both thrilling and realistic and make a point about an issue, in this case cybersecurity, that I consider to be profoundly important and underemphasized in today's world.
And my side of it, when I grew up in a small, we both grew up in small towns, and in my small town, nobody ever came, but somewhere along, when I was 8 or 9 years old, President Eisenhower came to town, and I never got closer than 300 or 400 feet from him, but I never forgot that. And I also have tried never to forget where I've come from and not to get a big head about anything that happens in my life. So the opportunity to me, when I got to write a book with President Clinton, was irresistible.
How did it actually work? I know that you both write in longhand. I'm assuming you weren't faxing portions to each other. Like, did you get together periodically?
There was a little faxing, yeah.
Well, you got 2 troglodytes writing in longhand, right? It was typed up then, and we talked about it. Jim prepared an outline. I responded. We agreed on an outline. He then sent me 20 questions, what you might call the authenticity questions. And we started with, if the president goes missing, how would he go missing? Physically, how would it happen? And I tried to answer all those. And then there was a draft of the first chapter, and we spent it back and forth and back and forth. And we did that all the way to the end.
Yeah, we went back and forth on the first 2 chapters, I'd say half a dozen times. And pretty much everything went that way, whether it was the outline or individual chapters. Yeah.
Well, you've worked with many co-authors before,
I have.
Jim.
You want to try it? You ready?
This had to be different.
See, we alternate words. She's not fast enough.
Did you disagree on anything? Were there like plot elements that you...
I don't think there was ever a This has been a great joy for both of us. I think we both got a kick out of it. It's been a lot of fun. We're enjoying this. It's really great being here tonight. No, we never disagree. My thing, if you want an enterprise to work nicely, and I think it would work in Congress as well, if you, I think it might, but if you go in with mutual respect, which I think we had, and then you listen, and I think that's what we did. Mutual respect, and then we listened.
I also think it helped, like, he trusted me if I said this wouldn't work this way, it would work that way. Or trying to get the voice of the president to be authentic. And I trusted him when he said, for example, one of the things we tried to show and couldn't quite get done as we wished was how no matter how big the crisis you're facing, you don't get to stop being president on everything else. That all these decisions keep coming up, you got to make them. If they were easy, they would have already been made and you just check a box. And so we were trying to show that in a big debate about Medicaid expansion through a special provision of the law which would enable a Republican governor from Georgia to say, I expanded Medicaid without getting involved in that terrible bill, which helped the people of Georgia, but also helped her politically. Do you do it or not? And can it really be done? And by the time we explained it fairly, it was just too long. And he said,
Tell the president we can't go 300 pages before something happens.
Yeah. And I realized that, he'd done this a lot and I never had. And not everybody is like me and can stay interested in the minutiae of policy details until the first person gets killed.
But, Mr. President, you are a voracious consumer of thrillers yourself. Is there one thing that just always annoys you that they never get right with a political thriller or a book about a president?
That they never get right?
Yes, that you thought, okay, I will finally do this correctly in this book?
Well, let's just start with something non-written. There are all these political shows on television. The West Wing was a very good show because it featured the ensemble of the staff. So Martin Sheen didn't have to carry the whole show. He was not the subject of it. You couldn't make it interesting. Gina Davis, I thought, was fabulous as the first woman president, but the show didn't last but a season because you simply couldn't take just one person and have enough credible and exciting interest. And Scandal, I love Shonda Rhimes, and I love Kerry Washington, and I love the president a lot, who was very kind to our family in the recent season. But it's not true that these people commit murder all the time. Or, it hasn't been. And the same thing is true of House of Cards. The first 3 years were a rip, man. They were great, but it just didn't happen. So what I thought was that once you put pen to paper, the more realistic they were, the more wooden it seemed, and the more exciting they were, the more unreal it was. So we tried to see, can we make it real and exciting? And he's a genius at that.
Well, one of the things we try to do is, and this is an interesting thing, can you write a beach read that also has some importance? And I think there are a couple of important things about this book. One is, which the president will talk a little bit about, is cyber terrorism and how devastating it is, how real it is, how what's in the book is very real, in spite of what Janet Maslin had to say. But that's one piece. The other piece is just the importance of the presidency, because the president mentioned Scandal and House of Cards, and then we were just on Colbert and Saturday Night Live, et cetera, where we've been making fun of the presidents for 30 years, which is all healthy and good, but people start forgetting how important that job is. And we wanted to remind people so that when they go in, I'm not being political here, but when they go in and they're going to cast a vote, that we really want to make sure there's somebody in there who's going to be up to the job. No politics.
How much of you, Mr. President, is in the character of Jonathan Lincoln Duncan?
How much of me?
Yeah.
Well, let me make, first of all, one more phrase. The most realistic show on television on politics
We're not supposed to talk
is
about
Madam
TV. This is a
Secretary.
book talk.
It's the one that's the one that's closest. This guy is his own self. He's a Gulf War veteran. I wasn't. He's from North Carolina, and he grew up, and his best friend stayed with him his whole life. There's a lot of that in me. But I just went to my 50th college reunion, and the first thing I did was have lunch with my 4 roommates and their spouses. And Hillary asked me if she could go because she's always been so amazed at how all of us stayed together all these years. And it's an old-fashioned Southern thing. He believes in what he believes in, but he also believes in treating other people decently, and they're got half good minds, and giving them a chance to work in good faith. But he wasn't modeled on me. And the first draft I got proposed from Jim had a Southern governor who was of age to fight in the first Gulf War. The speech that he gives at the end of the book, which you'll read, is what I believe. And I saw there was one critical review of the book. The book reviews on the whole have been very good, but one of them said, this is a riveting good book, and it was practically, its realism was wrecked by this speech, as if everything I believe is no longer realistic. Which may be true, who knows? But I still think you should always speak to the American people about what you hope will happen, what you believe should happen. Robert Burns and Andrea del Sarto said, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? So I believe that. I don't think that's unrealistic at all. I think you should, inclusive nationalism is what we need. Inclusive tribalism, not exclusive, and that's why I love Black Panther. I think it's a metaphor for what we should do.
Yes.
That's what I believe in.
I'm not going to give away plot spoilers here, but we do want to talk a little bit about what happens in the book. And you start off the book with impeachment. You could have started off in many ways, but you decided to go right to that.
We want to grab those readers.
Is that why? Did you have any trepidation about starting off with a subject that?
No, and as a matter of fact, I didn't. And but it's very different, because if you read the book, you will see that the president says, unlike my experience, the president said, if I did what they think I did, then I could rightly be impeached and convicted and removed from office. And he says, they don't know the truth because this environment is so partisan and so leak-prone, I haven't told them. So I am partly responsible for this mess that I'm about to wade into, because I didn't feel that for the security of the country, I could tell them what the real deal is. It's much more of a metaphor for how things can get twisted when, to use the phrase in the book, the well of trust runs completely dry.
How much of your own experience from the impeachment process, how does that inform the way that you write about that in the book?
Only that the details are right. That as we describe generally what the definition of an impeachable offense is, based on English common law, since the Constitution didn't include it, but that's clearly what they were talking about, which were offenses distinctly political against the state. And then we recognize that in the modern era, it's become more political than not. But we talk about how you have to navigate it. And in this case, the country is facing a major emergency, and it's going to be resolved one way or the other before the impeachment process can fully take hold.
I mean, the first chapters, they're very dramatic, and Mike Connolly, who's a very good mystery writer, he said that what Jim does me is that every chapter moves both the plot and the characterization forward and turns on the movie projector in our heads. And those first two chapters, they're very dramatic. It's a really tough session, and then there's quite a surprise at the end, which answers a lot of questions you have about how it could have gotten that tough.
We won't give that part away.
We won't.
But your book is not the only book that touches on impeachment that is out this year. There are a number. Obviously, the subject is in the air. And so I'm curious, Mr. President, how persuasive do you think the case for impeachment against our current president is?
I think, first of all, we should wait for Mr. Mueller to do his work and protect him while he does. I mean, he's played this thing straight. One of the reasons he's getting killed in the media in the fight over whether the FBI put spies in the Trump campaign, which is not so. They were counterintelligence. They thought they were probably helping candidate Trump because they thought other people were dealing with Russians and that he would want to know that, but couldn't tell him while they were doing their investigation. So I think that we have to wait and see what he says, then the rest of us can weigh in. Secondly, as a citizen, I recommend the American people focus on the midterms and showing up and realize that. And I say this in the book too. When Jim and I talked about this, and we argued for we argued for some reforms in the elections process, but you can make it as clean as you want, and if one America shows up in presidential elections and another smaller America shows up in midterm elections, you're going to keep having this mess we've got. Because most governors, state legislatures, and all the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate are voted on when there is no presidential election. And my party tends to be too oriented toward the presidential election and too little oriented toward the non-presidential elections and building the systems necessary to guarantee that whatever the consensus of the country is reflected in both elections. And until you get that right, there's going to be too much gridlock.
It's a real challenge to write fiction about the president these days, I'll tell you that. I don't know if you heard the latest, I don't know if this is accurate, but it's in newspapers that Rodman has been invited to Singapore by the president. I don't know if that's true. Dennis Rodman, it's like, okay. I don't know how do you
improve on that?
Yeah, I don't.
Well, Kim Jong-un likes them.
But it is an ongoing theme throughout the book, the sort of tensions between the political concerns and the sort of the right thing to do, and that runs throughout. And so it sounds
as intense as what happens in the book is in these 4 days, probably the most intense experience any president would have gone through. The rest of it keeps going. All of those other things keep happening, which President Clinton knows.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most interesting things about the book is that there's constantly 16 things pulling at the President Duncan's attention. And I figured that had to be your input, Mr. President.
Well, yeah, being president basically is about three things. You get in and you do what you said you do, or you try. And if you can't, you say why you've changed and what you're doing. But it's important, in our family, we say it's important to get caught trying, so you do that. But you can't ignore the incoming fire. George W. Bush becomes president, and 9/11 happens. He and Al Gore had, I thought, very interesting, vigorous debates. Nobody asked either one of them about 9/11. What are you going to do if the World Trade Center comes down? And you can't ignore what happens that you wish wouldn't happen. If it's AIDS in South Africa, the former President Mbeki was elected, Nelson Mandela kind of put him up as his chosen successor because he thought he could build a modern economy like Mandela built a modern political state, And then all of a sudden he's got more AIDS victims than any country in the world. And he tried, I think quite unsuccessfully, to avert or dealing with that and keep trying to work on the economy. It never works. Third thing you got to do is look around the corner and toward the future. I issued the first cybersecurity memorandum 21 years ago. So we didn't do this because of the election and Russian hacking the election. We did it because right now it may change. Go back to your question. It may change. But right now, whether people are upset about the Russian hacking of the election, whether and what happened may depend on who they voted for.
Do you think that the Russians interfered?
But if the lights went out, every Democrat and Republican in this auditorium would be upset. You know, if one of you got ill and you went to the local hospital and there was no power and none of the machines would work and the backup had been taken out, you'd be upset.
And all your bank records are not just gone, they're wiped out. So there's no record of whatever money you had. And Wall Street, same thing. It's all wiped out. That's the threat.
I want to get to the cyber terrorist threat, but I'm curious, do you think that the Russians interfered with the 2016 election?
Well, they certainly tried. I mean, that's pretty obvious. In September, the government knew, we now know, that Putin was personally directing this effort. And, you know, some things are obvious. When you hack all the RNC emails and you hack all the DNC emails and you release the DNC emails, you don't release the RNC emails. There's a reasonable effort to be drawn from that, the conclusion, I mean. But do we know whether it made a difference or not? We don't. We know that Jill Stein, the preferred alternative of the Russians, got more. The difference in her vote in 2012 and 2016 was more than the difference in the election in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That doesn't mean the Russians did it, but it makes you scratch your head anyway.
So again, not giving anything away, but clearly this is a novel about cyber terrorism. And you mentioned that you issued the first memorandum on the subject, but it was a very different threat back then. I mean, this was the era in which sort of Y2K, right, was the major threat. How different is it, and how much did you have to kind of imagine for this book?
It's much more complicated now. But Jim and I both, you know, I called the people that I work with and people I knew who are still working on this. And I said, give me 3 books to read. And then I called back and asked questions. I said, because I wanted to not tell you something that couldn't happen. And he was all in on this. He kept hammering me. Once he bought in on this had to be possible, he became like a reformed alcoholic. He was better than I was on this. And so it's come a long way. And you should be concerned. We got the biggest defense budget in the world. And we didn't increase cybersecurity very much. Cybersecurity position in the National Security Council has been abolished. And we do have some very vigorous and good private security companies in America, but for the last several years, Israel, and you'll see this in the book, has gotten 1/2 of all the private capital investment in the world in cybersecurity work. We should be putting more
one of the things that
research.
happened is, I mean, the more we read about, the more we studied, the more passionate we got about that something needs to get done in this country. Because, you know, as the president said, I mean, right now we have this massive budget, and this is the cyber part of that budget, and that's cockeyed.
You mentioned that President Trump eliminated the position of the cybersecurity czar. Is there any argument to be made to do that? I mean, what would you be doing differently were you in his position right now?
Well, you know, maybe he has an argument for why he did it. Maybe he wants, maybe the Defense Department's coordinating it. Maybe there's some other way. I don't know that because I don't get any security briefings. All I know is that all of our systems are, in theory, hackable. and it's not just elections. And so what we've got here is an attempt, first of all, to protect them against hacking, and second, and we do that a little bit, as you'll see, and second, if you do get hacked, then you have to develop a defense in literally seconds if you want to avoid calamity. So in all conflict, offense precedes defense, right? Think about it. I hit you with a rock, you put the rock on the stick. I make a shield, you get it. We fight on horsebacks, I get in a castle, and then I got a moat. Then you get a catapult. And the whole thing, so we're now in an age when there's no possibility at the moment that we know of in cyber world of the thing that kept us from World War III with nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. So you want to close the gap as close to zero as you can between offense and defense.
And one of the things, we had a lot of interviews the past week with journalists from around the world, and everywhere we talked, they said, yes, this is something we should all get together on. Germany, Japan, Italy, Spain, everybody felt, yeah, this is a common threat, and this is something we all had to figure out a solution.
What were the 3 books that you read on cybersecurity that you mentioned to sort of?
I read Richard Clark's latest book. Mm-hmm. I read Ted Koppel's book, which, by the way, I thought was good, accessible for the reader. And then I read an older book. I actually read about 5 books, but I read an older book. The author I don't even remember the name of, but it was basically sketching the landscape of what was to come to prepare me for this. But every year there's something new. Every day there's something new. And therefore, you want the brightest people in the world. And essentially, in our book, we feature the Germans and the Israelis because they're really good in cyber defense, and the Russians because they and the Chinese are the best in cyber attack. And the Russians and the Chinese hacked the Defense Department computers, hacked the State Department computers, hacked some of our intelligence computers. And then there are little independent contractor whiz-bangs that work for them and others. And our systems are just inadequate. I mean, to go back to the election system, the then governor of Virginia, McAuliffe, took his computer to the annual hackers convention in Vegas, and it took him 6 minutes to hack. And a man named David Pepper, who, full disclosure, is the chairman of the Democratic Party in Ohio, but his father was head of, I think, Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati. John Pepper, wonderful guy, and they were a partner of ours of the global initiative. But Pepper wrote a book called The People's House about hacking more than 30 congressional districts with a program so sophisticated they just lowered the vote precinct by small votes to flip seats to make sure that we could have a national network of pipelines that would carry natural gas out of the Marcellus Shale from Pennsylvania and Ohio all over the country. But he was just describing it. I think this is a serious thing. We believe we have told you something that is not only exciting, but is true. And you don't want to have the people who are the true heroes of our book. You don't want to, our president wins in a life and death crapshoot. That's not the way you want to deal with this.
There are a lot of bad guys in the book. And I'm curious about, in a sort of...
Women, too.
There are some bad women, yes. Yes.
And some great women.
And I'm curious about the geopolitics of it, you know, especially in a sort of post-Cold War era and now kind of renewed, I don't know what you would call the current the tensions between Russia and the U.S. Is it tricky? Is it complicated coming up with sort of who the bad guys are and how that works?
Yeah, I think it was, and we went back and forth about, there is a traitor in the White House, and right until the last couple of months, we were back and forth in terms of who it is and then how that traitor would get dealt with.
And then you have to go back?
Well, one of the interesting things here, and this was a great contribution of the president, is to just keep insisting that these characters really are flesh and blood. Mm-hmm. And we worked, there is an assassin in the book, and who is a woman. I mentioned the bad people, yeah. But initially, I think, and the president certainly felt it, it was sort of a typical thriller kind of assassin, didn't really have flesh and blood. And we kept working on that, working on that, until at the end, you actually care about her, which I think is a mark of when you really have delivered something. And the same with a lot of, there was Danny Akers, who's the president's best friend. We were rewriting him a week before, we had to turn in the final manuscript. But you talk about the assassin a little bit.
Well, the assassin, I noticed, I'm terrible, this is my first, I'm an old dog, this is a new trick for me. So I've never written a novel before, so I've read all the reviews and everything. And one...
You're not supposed to read the reviews until after the book tour, and then you go back and you read them.
But I'd read all these. One of the otherwise quite perceptive reviews said, this assassin's just not believable. Nobody'd be like that. And with all respect, that's wrong. and here's why. This assassin grew up in the horrors of the Balkan conflicts. I mean, I just went back to Srebrenica a couple of years ago for the 20th anniversary last year. I have seen what it did to people and what the Kosovo conflict did to people and the destabilization on the border in Macedonia and all the slaughter and mauling and, the violation of people's fundamental dignity. And I think that it's quite possible that a brilliant, angry, and deeply scarred person could find his or her way into this way of making a living. And I think it's important to recognize that there are people like this all around the world, and there's people we have to contend with too, which is why it's important never to stop trying to change people's minds as well as thwart them.
The character that you're talking about is an Abkhazian separatist, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly? From the Republic of Georgia, which I think will send many people running to Google to figure out exactly where that is. And then you have another character who is Turkish-born, but specifically non-Muslim. And then you have the Russians and a fictional group, the Sons of Jihad. How realistic is this kind of multinational threat?
Oh, I think it's really realistic. I think first you have a state actor, Russia, right? Then you have the people who paid for it, who are people who aspire to take over another country. And then you have all these hacker whizzes who work for the highest bidder. And then you have all these mercenaries who are, if anything, we underwrote them in terms of their significance in fighting wars throughout the world now, which is, to go back to something Jim said, it's why it's important that we make as many deals as we can, not only with our friends, but with our potential adversaries. Because the nation state itself is under assault today from within and without. And so with Russia, you ask how to manage an adversary. We do what we did in the Cold War. We make whatever agreements we can. We work together whenever we can. And we oppose them when we must. And we never, never, never pretend that it's okay to kill your own citizens just because they disagree with you.
I do have one question for you. Okay.
Uh-oh.
Now, I don't know if you did this or if somebody who works for you, but of all the people you could have had to review our book, why Sean Hannity?
That part is
that was a joke.
fiction, yes. But I'm curious because we're talking about these very serious threats, geopolitical, cyber terrorism. These are scary things, and yet you said at the very outset, this is a beach read. This is supposed to be a fun book. How do you mix
Well, what
the
I
kind
said
of
is,
fantasy?
it's how do you make a beach read, or can a beach read be important? And I think that it can be. And I also think it was important for us that I'm not a big fan of preaching to the choir. I really like to reach out, and so does the president. So the idea of putting a couple of important things out and making the book very accessible was important for us. We really think that's essential, and it's a key to all my kids' books. I have a book coming out in October, Max Einstein, and the Einstein Commission came to me, and they said, we want to spread the science of Einstein across the world and really get kids involved. And I really took that very seriously. But the Einstein Commission, the estate was very smart, and they said it must be entertaining. So in other words, your job, Patterson, is to make Einstein entertaining for children. But once again, how do you do a beach read for kids where they're actually going to walk away from it learning something about Einstein and being more curious about Einstein? So that's similar to what we needed to do here, we felt.
I also want to say one thing. You pointed out that he has worked with a lot of co-writers, and that's true. He puts out a lot of books every year. But I am living proof that he is the best plot twister I have ever seen. There's a reason he's sold 375 million books, and it has very little to do with all of us who co-wrote. Now, in my case, I helped a little on several fronts, I think, but the thing he's good about is, like he wanted to write a serious book, so this is a longer book than he normally writes. But he still wrote the short chapters because that keeps it moving for you. And along the way, after we filled out the tree of the outline with which we started, he figured out 4 or 5 twists in the plot that the first time I read it, I said, God, that's good. I wish I'd have thought of it.
We do have an 11-page chapter in this book.
Yeah, I know. That's really long for him.
Yeah.
But, Mr. President, you are also a best-selling author, and you've written critically acclaimed books. I'm curious, Jim, what did you learn about writing from the president?
Well, the president's a great storyteller. One of the things he gave me for the holiday, a Christmas present, he gave me his speeches he had made at various people's funerals. And initially I'm going like, but I got to tell you, you read this book and you realize what an incredible writer and storyteller the president is. So the storytelling was very useful. I think, as I said earlier, he really pushed to make sure that these characters were as flesh and blood as we could make them. That was really important. I think other things. I came to understand what a trap it is to be in the White House, and you can't go out to buy a candy bar. I mean, it's the secrets. They're here, the Secret Service. We can't do anything. The one thing, though, and this is a little cornball, but it's so true. I came into this relationship feeling, very good about the president, but after a year with him, after a year with them, this is an incredibly good human being who has spent his whole life trying to do the right thing for this country.
It is true that I did do one of my annual speech books. I included, I've reached the age when a lot of my friends are passing away. And important people, Mandela, Helmut Kohl, lots of others. And then people you never heard of that mean something to me. But I'm an old-fashioned Southerner, and we believed in going to funerals and honoring people. And that if you were asked to speak at one, you should tell the story of the people who had departed. Because everybody's got a story. And that story deserves to be told and respected. And that's what we try to do in this book. We try to tell the story of the president, the story of his major adversary in the Congress, the story of the assassin, the story of the mastermind of the attack, the story of the geniuses who can't live with themselves and try to help us thwart it after doing it. And his great gift is he can do it in fewer words than I can.
Although he got us up there on this one, 150,000 words. That's long for me.
One of the main reasons people read is to escape, and I think we've been hearing in the last couple of years when there's a lot going on, both domestically and internationally, that people are looking to escape. And I'm curious if you again worried that the reality that the sort of the very dangerous scenarios that you outline in the book sort of interfere with this idea of escape reading, or if that was important to include.
Don't quite follow that one.
All right.
Sorry.
Well, let me ask this, because you read a lot of thrillers when you were in office. You were photographed reading one of Mr. Patterson's novels, I think When the Wind Blows in 1999. I mean, did you turn to that kind of fiction to escape the pressures of being in office?
Yes. I started reading mysteries and thrillers back in earnest back in the early 80s. But before then, I sort of felt it was a guilty pleasure and I should be relentlessly improving my mind. I remember the first time I went to Russia on a train was the Soviet Union, and on the New Year's Eve, 1969 and 70, and I was stopped at the Swedish-Russian border, I think, or the Swedish-Finnish border. And then I was stopped again at the Finnish-Russian border. And this Russian guy he saw I was American and I had a beard, and he's so hoping he'd get some good porn. And all I had was a copy of War and Peace. Oh God, he was so bummed out. But anyway, I soon got over that and started consuming thrillers. But let me also say, I think that in this genre, if you're good, you can anticipate things. Now remember, Tom Clancy, whose politics were as different from mine as daylight and dark, wrote a book about a terrorist airplane crashing into the Capitol Dome 3 or 4 years before 9/11. And I ran into Tom after 9/11. I was getting ready to testify before that commission. You remember the 9/11 commission? And it was interesting. At the time, all I wanted to do was to figure out how to do better with this. And so I said to the commission, I said, I'd like to begin by telling you the mistakes of omission and commission I think I made. If you think I did anything wrong, for God's sakes, put it in the report. I am not here to cover my backside. We are here to try to deal with a whole new threat, the complexity and detail of which we have not come to grips with fully. So I saw Clancy, and I came up to him and I said, Clancy, I know what's going to happen in this darn 9/11 report. They're going to say everything that happened. They didn't quite, but they came pretty close. And then they're going to fix yesterday's problem while somebody's planning tomorrow's attack. You crashed that plane into the Capitol Dome before 9/11. You should volunteer to help your country and be in a small group of people that have a little office in a Pentagon or somewhere or off campus to think about what hasn't happened and how we can defend against what hasn't happened. And he looked at me like I was 3 bricks shy of a full load. But I still believe that. I spent enormous amount of time reading these books to try to anticipate what might happen.
To some extent, that's what this book does. But I think it's an enjoyable enough experience reading the book. There's enough suspense. There's enough questions you want answered that it still is a good read, I think.
All right, Mr. President, you brought up porn. We're not going to talk about that, but there's not a lot of sex in this novel. But as a reader of political thrillers and of spy novels, I'm always looking at the depiction of women in these books, and it tends to be very stock characters in general, damsels in distress, dangerous babes, killer babes, loyal wives, vice presidents. And I'm curious, obviously you are both men writing this book. How did you want to address the women characters in the book in 2018, writing this kind of novel?
Honestly, I don't care if it's 2018 or 2000. You know, to me, it's the same deal. I grew up in a house full of women: mother, grandmother, 3 sisters, female cat. Buzz and the buzz and purr is still in my head. I mean, that's just the way I was brought up. I have great respect for women. I've always had powerful women in my books. And I think the president was the same way. There were a lot of women in this. The vice president is a woman. The chief of staff is a woman. Head of the FBI is a woman. Assassin is a woman. And they're all pretty powerful.
And was that a deliberate decision to do that?
I don't even think it was to me, it's just not even a big deal. It's like, yeah,
Literally,
why not?
We never had a conversation about it. The president's got 4 days in this book. He's sick. In addition to all the other problems, he's got this rare blood disease, right? He's still grieving the loss of his wife. He's trying to keep his daughter alive. He doesn't have time to think about it. He does say he hopes he kind of gets back in the game afterward because his wife on her deathbed said, "Promise me you won't live your life alone. Promise me you'll find someone else." That's as close as we get. Why?
But we never talked about it. You know, like,
We literally
let's put
never had a
bunch
conversation about it. It was nothing conscious about it. The South African doctor who saves his life is a woman, a black South African woman. The FBI director is the first African-American woman to lead the FBI. She gets the job because she's the best qualified. There is no woman in this book, including the assassin, who is not supremely well qualified for the role she's playing. And I think that's important because if you're trying to open doors for people and make sure they get equal treatment, in the beginning, sometimes you just have to look a little harder. But they're there. If you believe ability and willingness to work hard are evenly distributed across gender lines or race lines or you name it lines, in the beginning you have to look because the talent pool right in front of your face is often different from the way the country looks. But once you start looking, then you stop thinking about it. And I think that's what I wanted people to see, that, you know, good, bad, or indifferent, you know, there are 2 women now running Northern Ireland. I'm very proud of that, you know, after this 20th anniversary of the peace agreement in Northern Ireland this year, and I've been twice. I laughed, I ragged them pretty bad last time, but they always send me in as I'm one step short of a mummy, but I'm the one guy who, you know, tried to be fair to both sides and got them together. We did all this. But the woman who heads the Conservative Party and the woman who heads the Sinn Féin are the 2 most powerful politicians in the country. And they're not doing any better than the men did in putting the government back together. And I said, look, you got to do this. You know, you got to do it. And I know you can. But they're new, to be fair to them, they're new in the job. And when you get into the job new, sometimes you think the only way to secure your position is to first show how tough you are to the people on your extreme wing who could take you down. And it turned out to be something that transcended gender lines. But I think they'll get it done. It's just a matter of time till we have a woman president, and just a matter of time till women are in a position where we stop thinking about their gender and start thinking about what they can do.
Do you think...
That's what I think.
Do you think that gender got in the way of Hillary being elected president?
Little. But I think look, I think there were a lot of things to it, but I think she overcame the Brexit thing and everything. Until the end. I think by winning the 3 debates, the conventions, and standing up to that committee for 11 hours in a way no man could have, I think it overcame the errors she made in her campaign and the gains that Mr. Trump made on the white working class. But it made the race close enough so that Comey's late announcement could swing it. That's what I think happened. And once that happened, then you can also say that maybe the Russians did have a decisive impact because you're talking about flipping, you know, well, the margins of loss were 44, 27, and 11. You figure it out. So you divide them by half, that many people switch and you win. So, you know, anybody could sneeze could have caused it. But I think we'll get over it. But I think a lot of people who have sexist notions could pass a lie detector test if they don't.
A lot, I think in the last couple of years, we've seen how much has changed with regard to gender equality in this country, and then to a certain extent, how little has changed. And I have to bring this up, and I'm not the first to bring it up on this book tour for you. On the Today Show, you were asked about looking back at the Monica Lewinsky situation. Were you surprised to be asked that? What? Were you surprised that that came up at this point?
No, I wasn't surprised, and I talked about it before, but what surprised me was the flat-out assertion that I'd never apologize. And it wasn't my best day because that's what I got mad about, not being asked about it. And I should have remembered that that man is young enough to be my son. And he probably, after it was over, I said, I've heard you're an honest person, so I actually believe you didn't know that. He said, I didn't. But to be fair to the Today Show, they did run my apology on television. But they also had me looking angry, so that a lot of people said, well, he doesn't really care. So I will say again, you know, I apologize to the people who were most hurt, my family, Hillary and Chelsea, to Monica Lewinsky and her family, to my staff and cabinet, to the people of the United States. I meant it then, I mean it now. I've lived with it in ways you can't imagine, and I've tried to do better. And I think that when something that was that painful is thrown up again after 20 years, after it was fully litigated, that you tend to freeze up, and it wasn't my finest hour. And I'm sorry, because a lot of people never heard it and don't still know what the real facts were, and it's okay. I messed up, and I own that. And no mistake by anybody else, including that young man aggressively saying I didn't apologize, can justify the fact that I got mad when I should have been saying I got a chance to tell a whole new generation that the journey I've been on the last 20 years is one the country has to take, and that Me Too is demanding we take it, and the sooner the better. And that's what I think.
I'm sure that I'm far, far younger than that young man, but I do remember that apology, and one of the things that you emphasized was that, you know, this was a public apology and you haven't spoken to her or corresponded with her in any way privately. And I'm curious if she were here now, what would you want to say?
Well, if she were here now and I were to speak to her, it wouldn't be a private conversation if I answered that question.
Wouldn't be. I think, though, you know, it's hard to deny that there is a very public conversation going on around Me Too, and Ms. Lewinsky herself has brought up and written about this recently. She wrote a piece in which she said, looking back now upon it now, even though she didn't feel this way at the time, that she felt that, you know, given the inherent power difference between an intern who essentially has no power and a president who has a lot of power, that she felt like it's unavoidably a situation of exploitation or sexual harassment. Do you agree with that?
I've said all I have to say. It happened 20 years ago, and I apologize for it. And other people can draw their conclusions, and different conclusions have been drawn. I've read a variety of articles, including some of them by women who strongly dispute that. I'm not going there. You're free to draw your own conclusions. The only thing that really matters is that we keep getting better as a country. We need to deal with this. And what I said, the other thing that I thought was subject to some misunderstanding was that I strongly supported the Me Too movement, but didn't always agree with where it had gone. And what I meant by that is I want to see a merger of Me Too, Time's Up, and a gender-based version of what Starbucks did on race for its non-employees. Its non-employees. You think about it, like the civil rights movement started with marches, went on to laws, and then went on to change the way we live. It's not done yet either, by the way, as we saw. But at least we're getting there. That's what I want to happen with the whole women's movement. I feel that I owe it to the life my wife has lived, to the person my daughter grew up to be, to the way I let them down, and mostly to all the fabulous women that have worked with me and been a part of my life from the get-go. And so that's all I want to say. In terms of anybody else's opinion, it's their opinion, and you're free to have it or disagree or say. You should debate that. I'm the last person in the world ought to be weighing in on that.
To go a little bit, talk about the current president, President Trump. I think there's a lot of anger among women over the way that they felt he treated Hillary during the election in 2016, over the way he treats women in general, both now and historically. And I think it's a different subject, but there's also sort of what he's doing overall, or what people perceive he's doing with the culture, and both in terms of his policies, his sort of personal demeanor. Certainly with books, he has made it quite clear that he doesn't really read, and I'm probably yeah. What do you, I mean, are you worried about the sort of the state of the culture under this presidency?
Yeah, but my take on this might surprise you. Obviously, I took a dim view of what he said about Hillary. But to his supporters, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, because there's a larger truth, which is that he's right and we're wrong. So you can treat everybody like a subhuman if they disagree with you. She's the finest public servant I've ever known, and a totally honorable person, and it was ridiculous and painful and sadly effective. And he had no small number of people in more subtle ways playing in the election who were designed to try to reinforce that. But the most important thing you should worry about is what it's doing to other people. You know, how it's changing other people. Like, you know, you almost feel sorry for Roseanne Barr, that mayor in West Virginia that called Michelle Obama that horrible name, that female mayor. It's like they didn't get the memo that only president gets to talk about people like that. They have to pretend to be that. And then those of us who disagree with him, we're inclined to answer in time. I suppose I criticized Donald Trump personally less than any person involved in the campaign. I went around saying, this is what he wants to do, and this is why it's bad for you, and this is why you ought to be for her, because it's good for you. Our tendency is to take every political campaign and make it personal. It's more interesting in the short run, but you overlook things like cybersecurity. Did they discuss cybersecurity in the debates? No, they were too busy, you know, dealing with all this other stuff. Politics should be other-directed. And the most important thing is, thanks to the kids from Stoneman Douglas, thanks to the kinds of elections and these special elections, thanks to the first transgender state representative from Virginia who got elected by promising to get rid of traffic congestion. You laugh. These are other-directed people. Doug Jones from Alabama was a fabulous U.S. attorney, other-directed person. And so I would just plead up with all of you. I just went to my 50th college reunion, so I'm in a different place in my life. I know that. My roommate had a Goldwater for President sticker on when I walked in the door. He is a magnificent human being and has lived a magnificent life. If you want to read about him, you can read the letter I wrote. It's on my Facebook page to my class. But the point is, life is too short for you to respond in kind. Don't let it change who you are. Be other-directed. It's still better to be generous. It's still better to be inclusive. That's why some of you laughed when I mentioned Black Panther earlier, but it's a metaphor for the kind of inclusive tribalism we need. That's what I think. And that's why, but let me just one more time, I know it sounds like a hawk in the book, but I am. But that's what we tried to do. We tried to say, okay, they're having this fight, the president and Congress. A lot of these guys are not acting in good faith. Terrible. In the end, what matters is the country going to be safe from this threat or not? And I can just tell you, when you get to be my age, all that really matters are people better off when you quit than when you started. The kids have a brighter future. Or are they coming apart, or things coming together? The rest of this is background music. Now, should we all try to get better morally? Yes. Should we take these big sweeping social movements and put the pedal to the metal and speed it up and make it sweep across the country? Yes. Have women waited too long for this? Yes. Are we still too racist and too bigoted in other ways? Absolutely. So what's the answer to that? Be other-directed. Don't let it become like them. Don't become like the people you say you don't like. And it's a head game. All great contests in life are head games. Keep yours.
All right. To continue on a note of inclusion, I want to ask some questions that we've gotten from our Facebook Live viewers. Khalil asks, how did you determine what was safe enough to divulge about the inner workings of the White House?
Well, on just the inner workings, I actually checked with some people to make sure that the stuff we tell you about how the president goes missing. And I say in one case that this room, the vice president stayed, for a while during 9/11. After 9/11. I checked to make sure that all that was a part of the public record. There were a couple little bells and whistles we could have added that I actually weren't sure were declassified, and so I didn't. Everything I talked about in describing the threat itself, and I thank Jim, he trusted me on this. I basically double-checked with one or two people I worked with because I have not taken any security briefings since I left the White House except when a president asked. Like when I went to North Korea, President Obama gave me a lot of security briefings. When I did a thing or two for President Bush, she did the same. But I basically, because Hillary was first on the Armed Services Committee and then Secretary of State, I decided, as many speeches I give, I could accidentally say something because how can you remember where you heard what, right? So I know I didn't do anything that violated the security protocols of the country with that.
All right,
we did a lot of fact checking before we ever sent the book into the publisher. Just
we
to be
had
careful.
some help.
And we were careful about cyber terrorism too.
We
not to give too much
thanked some people in the book, and you'll be able to see who we thanked and know that we got close enough to where if we were stepping over the line, we'd have been jerked up.
All right, we have lots of questions from our Facebook viewers about your process and all of that, but I like this question from Holly on a very different subject. Having eaten, I think, half of your vegan spread back there in the green room, she asks, what are the daily habits that keep you mentally and physically healthy?
I try to take a vigorous walk every day, and I'm not always making it on this tour, so I may go crazy right in front of you. But I try to read a lot in things that have nothing to do with politics, both literature and nonfiction. I try to see my grandchildren twice a week, once with Hillary and once alone, and she tries to do the same. They're 3 and almost 2. I expect them to be on Broadway and doing quadratic equations any day. And I stay in touch with my friends. I mean, I have been blessed. And that's what I do. And I try to get home in time if I have to be out at night so that Hillary and I can unload the day to each other before we fall asleep.
I'll tell you one thing. This is an interesting just observation. We went out, Sue and I, my wife, went out to dinner with the Clintons last week, I guess it was. And, you know, a lot of stories about, you know, what do they like, da-da-da-da, you know, good stories and some stories that are kind of crazy. But one of the things we noted was, like, about 3 times during dinner, they were holding hands. That's who they are, which I think is great. Yeah.
Well, I want to
Sue and I, we hold hands every night before we go to sleep.
Well, I read before I go to sleep, and I want to end on...
Well...
So do we.
The job.
We read too.
I read your book in a day, and I need to end on the obvious question, which is, will there be a sequel?
Will there be a sequel? You know, honestly, and we said this before, we had so much fun doing this, and we're continuing to have fun. We really enjoy going out and talking to people. If we come up with a story that we really like in terms of Duncan, I think we'll consider it. But you know, right now, I think the president has got a book that he's gonna work on next, and I keep busy somehow.
I have loved doing this, and some days I felt like I was taking more than I was giving, because I really wanted to figure out how he did all that stuff. If it happens, it happens. But let's be honest here. This business is almost as tough as bringing out a newspaper. For publishers, they take a big chance on you. So it really depends on whether you guys like this book or not, whether there's another one.
All right, I'm going to take that as a to be continued. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
That was
Jim
great.
Patterson.
Thank you.
Thank you.